In December 2018, I was between jobs and struggling to make ends meet. It wasn't how I'd envisioned spending the holidays, especially after having just moved to a small town called Winterbrook, nestled deep in the snowy forests of New Hampshire. The town had a postcard-perfect charm: Victorian houses, pine trees heavy with snow, and a Christmas market that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. I'd rented a modest, two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. It was a bit run down, with creaky floorboards and outdated wallpaper, but it was all I could afford. The previous tenant had left behind some furniture and random odds and ends, including a dusty artificial Christmas tree packed in a box in the attic. I wasn't planning to decorate that year. Between the stress of job hunting and the loneliness of being away from family, I wasn't feeling the holiday spirit. But as Christmas Eve approached, I decided to set up the tree. It was a small attempt to make the house feel a bit more festive. The box was heavier than I expected, and when I opened it, a strange smell wafted out, something earthy and faintly metallic. The tree was unusual too. The needles were a deep, almost black green, and the branches had a gnarled, uneven quality that made it look oddly lifelike. Nestled among the branches were a few old ornaments: glass baubles in faded gold and red, and a tarnished star for the top. I set it up in the corner of the living room, plugged in some string lights, and stepped back to admire my work. Despite its peculiar appearance, it gave the room a warm glow, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of holiday cheer. That night, I woke up to a faint rustling sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. The old house had plenty of drafts, and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up, but as I lay there, the sound grew louder, more distinct, a soft shuffling like footsteps moving across the living room floor. My heart pounded as I reached for the baseball bat I kept by the bed. I crept down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the stillness. The living room was empty. The tree lights were still glowing softly, casting long shadows on the walls. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear any other noises, but the house was silent. Then I noticed something odd. The ornaments on the tree weren't in the same places I'd put them. The star at the top was slightly tilted, and one of the glass baubles was now lying on the floor. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness and went back to bed, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I found something even stranger. There was a pile of pine needles on the floor beneath the tree, but they weren't the plastic kind you'd expect from an artificial tree. These were real, dark green, and damp to the touch. I checked the box the tree had come in, thinking maybe it had been some kind of hybrid with real branches, but the label clearly read 100% synthetic. Unease began to creep in, but I tried to brush it off. I vacuumed up the needles and went about my day, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the noises returned. It started with the faint rustling again, but this time it was accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't coming from the tree. It seemed to be emanating from the walls, vibrating through the house like a distant chant. I lay in bed, frozen, until the sound finally stopped sometime before dawn. The next day, I called my landlord, a brusque older man named Mr. Garrison, to ask if he knew anything about the previous tenants. He seemed reluctant to talk, but eventually admitted that the house had been vacant for almost 2 years. The last people who lived there, they left in a hurry, he said. Didn't even bother to take all their stuff. You find anything strange? I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. Just some old Christmas decorations in the attic. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. If I were you, he said finally, I'd get rid of that tree. That night, I decided to take his advice. I dragged the tree out to the backyard, intending to leave it by the curb for trash pickup, but as I stepped outside, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I glanced up at the tree and froze. Its branches were moving, twisted and curled almost imperceptibly, like fingers clenching into fists. I dropped the tree and stumbled back into the house, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called my sister, Emily, who lived in Boston. "You're not going to believe this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Emily, ever the skeptic, laughed nervously. "You're just stressed. It's an old house. It's probably creaky or something." But I could hear the worry in her voice, and she promised to drive up the next morning to stay with me for a few days. That night was the worst. The noises started as soon as I turned out the lights, footsteps pacing the floor, the hum growing louder, more insistent. At one point, I swore I heard a child's voice whisper my name. I stayed in bed, clutching the baseball bat, too terrified to move. Around 3 a.m., there was a loud crash. I bolted downstairs to find the tree back in the living room, standing perfectly upright, its lights glowing with an unnatural intensity. The ornaments had changed, too. The faded baubles were now pristine, gleaming as if brand new, and the tarnished star on top shone with an eerie silver light. And the smell, that earthy, metallic scent, was stronger than ever. I stared at the tree, unable to look away, as a faint melodic sound began to emanate from it. It was a Christmas carol, but the words were wrong, twisted, sung in a language I didn't recognize. The branches began to move again, stretching outward like they were reaching for me. I ran. I grabbed my car keys and sped out of the driveway, not stopping until I reached a motel on the other side of town. I called Emily, sobbing, and begged her to come as soon as possible. The next morning, I returned to the house with Emily and Mr. Garrison in tow. I was half expecting the tree to be gone, for everything to look normal, and for them to think I'd lost my mind. But the tree was still there, though its appearance had changed yet again. The branches were bare now, stripped of their needles, and the ornaments had turned black, their surfaces cracked and oozing a dark, sap-like substance. Mr. Garrison turned pale. "This isn't right," he muttered. We dragged the tree outside together and burned it in a bonfire. The flames roared higher than they should have, and for a moment, I thought I heard that same twisted carol echoing through the smoke. When it was over, the air felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had hung over the house was gone. I moved out a week later. I don't know what that tree was or where it came from, but I do know one thing. I'll never set up another Christmas tree as long as I live, because sometimes the things we bring into our homes bring something else with them. I've always loved Christmas. Growing up, it was the one time of year when my family would put everything aside: work, arguments, worries, and come together. We'd bake cookies, watch Christmas movies, and decorate the house like we were competing in some kind of holiday contest. But the Christmas of 2015 changed all that. I was 22, living on my own for the first time in a small town in Pennsylvania called Ash Hollow. It was one of those places that feels like it's straight out of a Hallmark movie. Charming Main Street, friendly neighbors, and an annual Christmas festival that drew people from miles around. That December, I'd been feeling homesick. I couldn't make it back to Ohio for the holidays because of work, so I decided to throw myself into decorating my little rental house. I put up lights, hung a wreath on the door, and even found a small Christmas tree to set up in the corner of the living room. One evening, about a week before Christmas, I came home from work to find a package sitting on my front porch. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anything, and the return address was smudged, unreadable. The box was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no markings other than my name written in elegant, looping handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and carefully peeled back the paper. Inside was a wreath. It wasn't like any wreath I'd ever seen. The branches were black, like they'd been charred, and instead of berries or ornaments, it was decorated with small white bones. Tiny ones, like from birds or small animals. At its center was a ribbon, also black with the word welcome embroidered in silver thread. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who would send something like this? And why? I should have thrown it out right then, but something about it kept me from doing that. I told myself it was just a weird prank and decided to put it in the attic, out of sight, until I could figure out what to do with it. That's when things started to get strange. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something downstairs. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like paper being crumpled. I brushed it off as the wind or the house settling and went to sleep. The next morning, I found the wreath sitting on my kitchen table. At first, I thought I'd forgotten to put it in the attic, but when I checked, the attic door was still open, the light still on. My stomach turned. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. I carried the wreath back upstairs, shut the attic door, and made sure it latched. That night, the noises came back, louder this time. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving from the living room toward the kitchen. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering that I thought someone had broken into my house. When the officers arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow outside. The doors and windows were all locked, but the wreath was back on the kitchen table. I tried to explain it to them, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They gave me a half-hearted lecture about locking my doors and left. I felt embarrassed, but more than that, I felt uneasy. The next day, I called my mom. I told her about the package, the wreath, and the strange noises. She listened quietly, then said, "You need to get rid of it. Burn it if you can." She sounded serious, almost scared. That afternoon, I drove out to a clearing in the woods behind my house with the wreath and a can of lighter fluid. I set it on the ground, doused it, and struck a match. The flames roared to life, and for a moment, I felt relief. But then I heard it, a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. It was coming from the fire, a soft, chilling murmur that sounded like my name. I stumbled back, heart racing, but the fire was already dying down. Within seconds, it was out, leaving the wreath completely untouched. That night was the worst. The noises started as soon as I turned off the lights. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of furniture shifting under unseen weight. I stayed in bed, too scared to move, until I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of my front door unlocking. I bolted out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. When I reached the living room, the door was wide open, snow blowing in from the porch. The wreath was hanging on the inside of the door now, its black branches swaying gently. And standing in the doorway was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the top of the frame. It wore a cloak made of tattered black fabric that moved as if caught in a wind I couldn't feel. Its face, or where its face should have been, was hidden by a hood, but I could see the faint glow of 2 pinpricks of light, like distant stars. It didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence filling the room with a suffocating, icy weight. I don't know how long I stood frozen, staring at it, but when I finally found the strength to move, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove to a motel on the edge of town. I didn't care about the house anymore. I just needed to get away. That night, as I lay in the motel bed, I got a text. It was from an unknown number. It said, "You can't leave. It's already inside you." I threw my phone across the room, shaking. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to the house, everything was gone. The wreath, the footprints, even the package. It was like none of it had ever been there. But every Christmas since then, I've felt it. I'll wake up in the middle of the night and hear faint whispers, or I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. And sometimes I'll find a single black branch on my doorstep, tied with a silver ribbon. I've learned to live with it. But every Christmas Eve, I make sure to lock my doors and leave the lights on, because I know it's still watching. It started as an innocent trip, one of those quaint small-town Christmas experiences you see advertised online. My girlfriend, Anna, had found a deal for a week-long cabin rental in Thistlewood, an isolated village in the Appalachian Mountains. She was enchanted by the idea of snow-dusted trees, cozy fires, and handmade holiday crafts. Thistlewood wasn't on any major maps. In fact, its website looked like it had been made in the late 1990s. But the pictures showed a charming hamlet with cobblestone streets, old timber frame houses, and a towering Christmas tree in the town square. It seemed perfect. We arrived late in the evening on December 20th. Snow blanketed the roads, and the GPS signal cut out about 5 miles from the town. Thankfully, we'd printed directions. As we drove into Thistlewood, the sight of the place took my breath away. The houses were adorned with warm golden lights, and the enormous Christmas tree stood at the center of the square, its ornaments glinting in the moonlight. Anna was ecstatic, snapping pictures and marveling at how it looked like a scene from a storybook. But something about the town felt off. There were no cars parked along the streets, no footprints in the snow, and no signs of life apart from the glowing windows of the houses. The air felt unnaturally still. We checked into our cabin without issue. The owner, Mrs. Cora Whitmore, was a sweet older woman with a slight British accent. She handed us the keys and a hand-drawn map of the village. "Enjoy your stay," she said, "and do make sure to attend the lighting ceremony on the solstice. It's a tradition here in Thistlewood." Anna's face lit up. "That sounds amazing. We'll be there." But as Mrs. Whitmore turned to leave, her cheerful demeanor shifted. She glanced back at us, her eyes sharp and serious. "Just remember," she said, "don't stay out past midnight. And whatever you do, don't touch the Yule tree." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone. The next few days were idyllic. We explored the village, met a few locals who were friendly but distant, and browsed the Christmas market where artisans sold handmade ornaments and wreaths. Despite the charm, there were strange undercurrents. At the bakery, the owner, Mr. Elms, offered us gingerbread cookies to honor the old gods. When Anna asked about it, he laughed nervously and changed the subject. At the market, I noticed carvings of strange symbols on many of the stalls. Triangles within circles, spirals, and runes I didn't recognize. And then there was the tree in the town square. It was massive, easily 30 feet tall, with thick branches that seemed too perfect to be real. The ornaments weren't your usual baubles and tinsel. They were hand-carved wooden figures of animals, moons, and suns, interspersed with bundles of herbs tied with red string. Every time I passed the tree, I felt a peculiar sensation, like I was being watched. On December 21st, the winter solstice, the village came alive. At sunset, the townsfolk gathered in the square for the lighting ceremony. They formed a circle around the tree, holding candles, and began to chant in unison. The words were foreign, guttural, and carried a weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tree's ornaments seemed to shimmer as the chant grew louder. Then, all at once, the candles went out, plunging the square into darkness. A moment later, the tree burst into light, not from electric bulbs, but from small flickering flames at the tips of its branches. The crowd cheered, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the glowing tree. As the ceremony ended, Mrs. Whitmore approached us. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes piercing. Anna nodded enthusiastically. "It was incredible. Is this part of some old tradition?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled faintly. "Oh, much older than Christmas." That night, I couldn't sleep. Anna was out cold, exhausted from the day's excitement, but I kept hearing noises outside the cabin. A low, rhythmic hum, almost like the chanting from the ceremony. At midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The snow was untouched, but the sound was louder now, pulling me toward the town square. As I approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The ornaments on the tree were moving. The carved animals writhed as if alive, their wooden bodies creaking and groaning. The bundles of herbs swayed, and the flames at the tips of the branches flickered erratically. Then I saw him. A figure stood at the base of the tree, cloaked in shadow. He was tall, unnaturally tall, and draped in a dark robe that blended with the night. He turned toward me, and though his face was hidden, I felt his gaze pierce through me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice deep and resonant. I stumbled back, muttering an apology, and fled to the cabin. The next morning, I told Anna everything. She laughed it off, saying I must have dreamed it. But when we walked into town later that day, the tree looked different. The ornaments were gone, replaced by something far more sinister. Hanging from the branches were small, human-like figures made of straw and twigs. They swayed in the wind, and as I stared, I noticed tiny carvings etched into their skin. Symbols, runes. The townsfolk acted as if nothing was wrong. "Let's go," I whispered to Anna. "Something's not right here." Reluctantly, she agreed. We packed our bags and checked out of the cabin that afternoon. But as we drove down the snow-covered road, the car suddenly skidded to a stop. The path ahead was blocked by fallen trees. We had no choice but to turn back. That night, I woke to find Anna standing by the window, staring out at the forest. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. She didn't respond. I got up and touched her shoulder. She turned to me, and I gasped. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, and her lips moved silently as if reciting something. I shook her, and she snapped out of it, looking around in confusion. I don't know," she said. "I heard something." "What did you hear?" Her face paled. "Singing." The next few hours were a blur of terror. The humming returned, louder and more insistent, and the air in the cabin grew stifling. At exactly midnight, the chanting began again, this time accompanied by the sound of footsteps outside. I peeked through the window and froze. A procession of figures was marching through the snow toward the town square, each holding a candle. At the center of the procession was the robed man I'd seen the night before, his tall frame towering over the others. They gathered around the tree, and the chanting reached a crescendo. Then, one by one, they began to place the straw figures at the base of the tree. The flames on the branches roared to life, and the figures ignited, sending black smoke spiraling into the sky. I pulled Anna away from the window. "We're leaving," I said. As we ran to the car, the chanting followed us, growing louder and more distorted. The air seemed to vibrate with it, and the ground beneath us felt unsteady. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. Later, I tried to look up Thistlewood online, but there was no record of it. No website, no map, nothing. It was as if the town had never existed. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint hum of chanting in the distance, and I wonder if we ever truly left.